Hello, this is Gavin DeCosta, lecture 2. In the first lecture, I was looking at traditions of anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism that can be found within the Christian and the Roman Catholic tradition more specifically. In this lecture, I want to look at the 1960s, where we have a significant shift in the attitude of official Roman Catholicism in the shape of the Second Vatican Council. Let me just say a few words about what a council is. A council is where the church leadership, the bishops, the cardinals, under the authority of the Pope, come together, and the teachings that come from a council are therefore to be taken very seriously. There are two documents in the Second Vatican Council that attend to Catholic attitudes towards the Jewish people. The first question I want to look at is, how come this happened? After 2,000 years, nearly, of very strong anti-Jewish currents, what brought about this shift? Tragically, the obvious and first most important issue was the destruction of a third of world Jewry within Christian Europe. The Holocaust, or the Shoah, brought a terrifying searchlight to Christianity's complicity in various levels of anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism. Germany itself was dominated by Lutherans and Catholics, and in that sense the question was raised, especially in Germany, but in other European countries, how could this have happened? Was Christianity answerable to fostering, developing, and in fact being part of what happened at the Holocaust? The World Council of Churches addressed this question very early on and took on the difficult issues. The Catholic Church waited until the mid-1960s for the Second Vatican Council, but the teachings that have come out of that council have been hugely influential. Besides World War II and the Holocaust, there was already the recovery in the 40s and 50s of the biblical revelation tradition arising from Paul and his letter to the Romans. And we would find in the Vatican Council documents a constant attention to Paul's teachings, which were the key underlying the sort of shift that happened. And the third and final factor, and this is terribly important because when we're talking about large institutional historical shifts, there are often people behind those stories. And Jules Isaac, the Jewish historian, published a book that was very influential and affected Pope John the 23rd. Isaac argued in this book that the roots of Christian anti-Jewishness lay not in a doctrinal heart of Christianity, but in the charge that the Jews were guilty of deicide. Isaac argued that if that teaching could be removed, the roots of Christian anti-Semitism would be removed without a change in fundamental doctrine. Isaac and John the 23rd met before the council, and in one sense a slightly apocryphal story. After this meeting, John the 23rd asked Cardinal Bea to begin work on drafting something about the deicide charge which could be eradicated from the Christian tradition because it was not necessary or central or, in fact, accurate. So let's turn to the Council. Here we have two really important documents, and one of them is the dogmatic constitution on the Church, often known by its opening Latin words, Lumen Gentium, the light to the nations. And this dogmatic constitution has the highest level of authority in Catholic teaching and cannot be ignored. The second document we're going to look at is Nostra Aetate, again in Latin, in our times, but the official title is Catholic Attitude to the Non-Christian Religions. And Nostra Aetate is the document that was published in 1965 and has serious implications for the way in which Catholic attitudes were to unfold. There's a sort of rather exciting story behind the publication of Nostra Aetate, which I'd love to go into in more detail, but suffice to say here that the draft of the document, when it was known that the Church was going to address this question, no one had actually read the draft. It was only circulating amongst the committees that were dealing with the drafts. The Vatican experienced huge problems. The first was a negative reaction from much of the Arab world surrounding Israel. During this period, of course, the 47 and 48, after Israel was founded and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict begins, the Middle East becomes politically deeply sensitive. Arab governments were concerned that if the Catholic Church sided with Israel in any way, it would be too difficult for them to protect Catholic populations because of popular uprisings against Catholics. And the Vatican was warned that schools, churches, hospitals, and Catholic communities could be at risk. Furthermore, the Eastern Christian churches, including those that were united with Rome, were most concerned about any statement that might be seen to be favorable towards the Jews, which would jeopardize their own situation in majority Muslim countries. Thirdly, there was some in the Catholic Church, in the European and other cultures, that argued that nothing could be said about the Jewish people because they were guilty of deicide, and the curse that occurred in the Bible applied to them and their people. And it was precisely this particular tradition that was being addressed by John the 23rd. So the document was pulled, even though it hadn't been circulated, and then it was leaked. And the leaking is a bit of a scandal because everyone taking part in the process had promised total secrecy. It was leaked, published in the New York Times, and then it gained a reaction from both Jews, Muslims, and Catholics, and the situation was getting very difficult to handle. So a first draft came out in the second sitting of the council, and this was after the time of John the 23rd and in the time of Paul VI. And Paul VI felt the only way to navigate the difficulties was to make sure whenever the Jewish people were mentioned, so were the Muslims. And there we have the beginning of the story of eventually Nostra Aetate and Lumen Gentium addressing not only the Jewish people, but also Muslims and other non-Christian religions. So the Holy Spirit works in very curious ways, and I think this could be one of them. So what did the Council teach? In Lumen Gentium, paragraphs 14 to 16, and these particular documents are often forgotten or neglected when looking at this question. The paragraph 14 starts off with reiterating the traditional teaching that the Catholic Church is the true church founded by Jesus Christ for the salvation of all human beings. It also teaches that there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church, which is the ordinary means of salvation, but it now applies this teaching only to those who know the full truth of the teaching. Those who are what is called invincibly ignorant, which is a bit of a kind of technical term but has rather negative connotations. We might want to say those who do not know about this truth in their heart or in their mind are not judged negatively. And that's very important. So paragraph 14 addresses that central teaching and keeps it intact, but contextualizes it. Paragraph 15 addresses other Christian churches and acknowledges that those that are Trinitarian and baptismal do have the means to salvation. And then in paragraph 16, it turns to the religions. Now, I'm going to read the first few lines because they are really important. Finally, those who have not yet accepted the gospel are related to the people of God in various ways. Now, this sentence immediately addresses the Jewish people. In the first place, there is that people to whom the testaments and promises were given, and from whom Christ was born according to the flesh. Quoting Romans 9, 4-5. A people according to their election most dear because of their ancestors, for God never goes back on his gifts and his callings. Quoting Romans 11, 28-29. And then it moves on to Islam. Now note three things. The first is that Judaism and the Jewish people are seen as central to the way that God has moved in this world. Christ was born according to the flesh from those people that were chosen, going back to Romans 9. And then the second part of the claim, which is very important, coming from Romans 11, is that this people, according to their election, are most dear, for God never goes back on his gifts and callings. Now, what we see here in a dogmatic constitution is the elevation of Paul's teachings that had been neglected, so that one could have a positive doctrinal orientation towards the Jewish people and recognize them as most favored rather than cursed, those who have been always central to God's love, and in one sense, God will never go back on his gifts. Now, that's the doctrinal kernel. So we turn to Nostra Aetate to look at how that's fleshed out. In Nostra Aetate, we see four main achievements which are absolutely vital for understanding the future history of Catholicism after the mid-60s. First achievement is that the deicide charge against the Jewish people is revoked clearly. I quote from the document, paragraph 4, although the Jewish authorities with their followers pressed for the death of Christ, still those things which were perpetrated during his passion cannot be ascribed indiscriminately to all the Jews living at the time, nor to the Jews of today. Now that is absolutely addressing Isaac's diagnosis of where Christian anti-Semitism derives from the deicide charge. And while it doesn't attempt to rewrite history, for the Council has no authority to do that, it says that even while the Jewish authorities and their followers were complicit in the death of Christ, that guilt cannot be ascribed indiscriminately to all the Jews at the time or to Jews today. And with that particular sentence, we have the beginning of a new attitude towards the Jewish people. We find a clear, and this is going to the second big achievement, where all forms of, and I quote, anti-Semitism directed against the Jews, end of quote, is unacceptable. Now, what we see here then are two ways in which the teachings in Lumen Gentium are unpacked. First, in revoking the deicide charge. Second, in condemning all forms of anti-Semitism. The third achievement of Nostra Aetate is to repeat the point made in Lumen Gentium, that the Jewish people are still the subjects of God's promises and gifts. And it cites, once again, Romans 11. And it says, "Nevertheless, according to the Apostle Paul, because of their ancestor, the Jews still remain very dear to God, whose gift and call are without regret." And this raises the most important question after the Council. What does that mean about the Jewish covenant existing in contemporary times? Is it a valid covenant? Must be, because it was made by God with his people without regret, and God always keeps his side of the bargain, or her side of the bargain. The fourth main achievement is the Jewishness of the early church and apostles is clearly acknowledged. Quote, "It also recalls," this is the Council, "also recalls that the apostles, the foundations and pillars of the church, were born out of the Jewish people, as were many of those first disciples who proclaimed the gospel of Christ to the world." This means Mary, Jesus, Joseph were all practicing and devout Jews. We see from the Bible that they go and practice in the temple, participate in the festivities, etc. This Jewishness at the heart of the church is another important theme that's going to develop after the Council. So let me just register a few criticisms that were made of the Council. One was that it treated Judaism like a museum piece, something from biblical times, but no attempt to address modern Judaism. Secondly, there was no apology or acceptance of Catholic complicity in anti-Semitism. It made claims that anti-Semitism directed against Jews was always unacceptable, but it didn't say sorry. It didn't acknowledge its own guilt and participation. On those 2 points, I would simply want to say that things take time. It is true that contemporary Judaism is like a museum piece, but the Council is seeking doctrinal grounds, in my view, to address contemporary Judaism, and it does so after the Council. The apology for Catholic complicity has to wait until 2000. Both in the monumental document We Remember, which addresses Catholic and anti-Semitism during the Holocaust, but more importantly in John Paul II, the Pope's petitions on behalf of the Church for where it has gone wrong. And there he addresses explicitly many Catholics participating in the persecution of Jews and asking forgiveness. I want to end now by saying that after the council, and in a way the council was just the beginning, the Catholic Church established the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, and this operates in the Roman Curia. It was established in 74, and it operates under the wing of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. This is a very important group because they are, if you like, fully there to elaborate and develop the teachings that are coming out of the magisterium. Successive popes, especially Pope St. John Paul II, have developed the teachings from the Council in very significant ways, which we will address in Lecture 3. National bishops' conferences have dwelt on their own history, background, and here the US bishops, the German and the French bishops, have been deeply engaged with this question. And in all these three levels, the popes, the commissions, and the national bishops' conferences, there has been conversation with Jewish partners exploring painfully the difficulties and sometimes, to be honest, having, difficult ways or difficult problems to negotiate, which have not always been negotiated well. In the third audio, I will be looking at some of the, if you like, impact of the Council's teachings such that we're now in a new situation in relationship to the Jewish people. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.
Hello, everybody. This is Faydra Shapiro, and I just want to begin by noting that my role here is kind of to add to Gavin DaCosta's lesson and maybe digging a little bit deeper on some specific issues from a Jewish perspective. Now, before we start looking at history and the emergence of this revolutionary new approach to the Jewish people, I want to look a little more closely together at the structure of Nostra Aetate, the Church's declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. Because the structure tells us something important about the way the Catholic Church conceives of Judaism vis-a-vis other non-Christian religions. Nostra Aetate begins with the general and moves to become increasingly specific and detailed. It opens with a broad discussion about mankind and about the human condition. Then, in the second paragraph, Nostra Aetate moves to particular religions. There, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other religions get a sentence or two each. In paragraph 3, the declaration becomes significantly more detailed when it treats Islam in 6 or 7 sentences. But then, in paragraph 4, we have a section on the Church's relation to the Jewish people that is almost as long as all of the first 3 paragraphs combined and goes into far more detail. So I think it's important to note that it's not really a simple case of Christian and non-Christian. Not all non-Christian religions, we might say, are created equal. The very structure of Nostra Aetate makes clear that the relationship with the Jewish people is unique among non-Christian religions. We see this expressed quite powerfully as well through the fact that the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews does not fall under the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Now, the Church's ongoing dialogue with Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and others does. But as quirky as it sounds, religious relations with the Jews, in fact, comes under the Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity. And while there's certainly a historical reason for that, and I'll speak about that in a bit, it is significant, I think, that this has never been changed. at some level, the church understands that the Jewish question is actually a question about herself. As it states in a far more beautiful fashion in the declaration itself, when the church searches into her own mystery, she finds the Jewish people. So there is something Jewish at the heart of the church. And it is important to note that the Catholic Church becomes more and more sensitive to that fact following Vatican II. At the same time, there's been an unfortunately strong Catholic hand in the historical suffering of the Jews. And it's important to note that the Catholic Church also becomes increasingly aware of and sensitive to that fact following Vatican II. Perhaps most important will be, I think, the awareness that begins to dawn that the two are actually incompatible. The church cannot at the same time recognize and appreciate its Jewish heart, and at the same time participate actively or passively in anti-Semitism. Professor DaCosta mentions some of the difficulties that Nostra Aetate encountered in the process of being birthed, we might say. I want to focus here because I think that those challenges are really significant for Catholic-Jewish relations. And in order for us to look more deeply at them, we need to go over a little bit of pre-council history. Pope John the 23rd's announcement in January of 1959 that he intended to convene a general council came as a surprise to pretty much everyone. The previous council had been almost 100 years earlier, and the one before that some 300 years earlier. As part of the preparations for the Second Vatican Council, the Pope created the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity, and that was in June 1960, specifically June 5th. And you'll see why that's important in a moment. So on June 5th, 1960, the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity was formed. And as the name suggests, the committee was tasked with, Christian unity as it relates to the council that had just been announced. So that is helping the broader Christian world to participate and follow the happenings in Rome. Now, a mere 8 days later, on June the 13th, Pope John the 23rd had what would be a fateful meeting with Jules Isaac. As Professor DaCosta notes, Isaac was Jewish, an important French historian and educator whose wife and daughter were murdered in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, at Auschwitz. Now, Isaac had been long active in Jewish Christian understanding, and he was really committed to bringing attention to his conviction that anti-Semitism is in fact anti-Christian rather than some kind of essential or inevitable part of Christianity. And from that meeting with the Pope, an idea arose, the idea that perhaps this matter could be addressed in the church, could be addressed through this upcoming General Council. So about 5 months later, when the Secretariat for the Promotion of Christian Unity had their first meeting in November of 1960, they were surprised to learn that they had also been tasked with a special and for now secret mandate to try to address the Jewish question. Now, the first draft of their efforts to address the church's relationship with the Jewish people was entitled, and you'll forgive my Latin, Decretum de Judaeus, the Decree on the Jews. Now, that was completed in November of 1961, and it was this very document that would be finalized only 4 years later and after 4 drafts in a very different form, and would be called Nostra Aetate, the declaration of the Church's relationship to non-Christian religions. Unpacking the journey from the decree on the Jews, that draft, to Nostra Aetate reveals a great number of the challenges and issues that, in fact, don't ever disappear from the scene, because it was here that, we might say, the Vatican ran headlong into some very difficult realities: theological, political, and Jewish realities. Now, the theological reality, the theological challenge, might be better called an authority problem. What sources could the church use? What sources could the church rely on to try to engage in a more positive way with the Jewish people when church tradition offered precious little positive to work with? And the answer, significantly, is that paragraph 4 of Nostra Aetate, the paragraph that deals with the Jewish people, ends up by quietly bypassing 2,000 years of church teaching for a reliance instead on scripture in a concerted effort to find a way to acknowledge ongoing value to Jews and Judaism. So that, in a nutshell, is one of the great kind of theological issues that was faced in birthing Nostra Aetate. The second challenge was the political one, the fear on the part of many bishops that any kind of positive statement about the Jewish people might in some way legitimate the state of Israel, and thereby put at risk Christian communities in the Middle East, in countries that are hostile to Israel. Also, at the same time, other bishops in Africa and Asia, places with very little interaction with Jews, sought guidance on how they might think about the non-Christian religions that they engaged with every day: Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And so you might note that Nostra Aetate makes no mention of the Jewish state. And Nostra Aetate is no longer a statement about Jews, as was the decree on the Jews, but rather Nostra Aetate puts the Jewish people in a unique and privileged place among other non-Christian religions. Now, the third challenge is the one that I want to dig into a little bit more deeply here, and that is the participation and challenge presented by the Jewish community to the process of birthing Nostra Aetate. And I think that this specific challenge tells us a lot about not only the content of Catholic-Jewish relations, but also about its process. In the initial draft, Decretum de Judaeus, the decree on the Jews, we find a paragraph that caused a great deal of difficulty for the ultimate emergence of Nostra Aetate. And I'll read that out to you, and it will be also provided as part of the reading materials for this course. The paragraph states, "Furthermore, the Church believes in the union of the Jewish people with herself as an integral part of Christian hope. With unshaken faith and deep longing, the Church awaits union with this people. At the time of Christ's coming, a remnant chosen by grace, the very first fruits of the Church, accepted the eternal word. The Church believes, however, with the apostle, that at the appointed time, the fullness of the children of Abraham according to the flesh will embrace him who is salvation. Their acceptance will be life from the dead. Now, perhaps for Catholic listeners, this might sound like a completely reasonable hope, faith, and longing for Jews to accept Christ and for the Jewish people to become part of the Catholic Church. But when this conversion clause became public in 1964, the Jewish community responded quite resolutely. The most powerful example I want to speak about today comes from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Now, not all Jewish leaders favored any Jewish participation in this Catholic conversation, but Heschel was a keen supporter and participant. But his response to this hope for the conversion of the Jews was clear and unequivocal. He noted, "It must be stated that spiritual fratricide is hardly a means for the attainment of fraternal discussion or reciprocal understanding. A message that regards Jews as candidates for conversion and proclaims that the destiny of Judaism is to disappear will be abhorred by Jews all over the world and is bound to foster reciprocal distrust as well as bitterness and resentment." Rabbi Heschel, whose mother and sisters had been murdered by the Nazis, was forceful in his moral critique. "As I have repeatedly stated to leading personalities of the Vatican, I am ready to go to Auschwitz any time if faced with the alternative of conversion or death. Jews throughout the world will be dismayed by a call from the Vatican to abandon their faith in a generation which witnessed the massacre of 6 million Jews and the destruction of thousands of synagogues on a continent where the dominant religion was not Islam, Buddhism, or Shintoism." When we look now at paragraph 4 of Nostra Aetate, we can see that this conversion clause, the hope for the eventual conversion of the Jews and their entry into the church, is no longer present. But even more stunning is to note what is present. What is present in the final version of Nostra Aetate is a remarkable piece of theological work that A, emphasizes eschatological unity, and B, defines or authorizes that eschatological unity with the Old Testament rather than the New. Quoting from Nostra Aetate, that paragraph now reads, "In company with the prophets and the same apostle," referring to Paul, "the church awaits that day, known to God alone, on which all peoples will address the Lord in a single voice and serve him shoulder to shoulder." And that final quotation is from Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9. This very specific episode tells us two, I think, very important things about Catholic-Jewish relations. First, it's important to recognize that this matter of conversion is a live one that speaks to some of the broader issues that Professor DaCosta raised. The issue really about the tension between an eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people and universal salvation through Christ. For now, suffice it to say that a concern that Jewish Christian relations masks a conversion cause or even a conversionary desire is the number one Jewish anxiety when it comes to the question of Jewish Christian relations today. Second, I think that this tells us something important when it comes to process. We should note that the Jewish response was taken very seriously. What began with Pope John the 23rd's meeting with Julie Zach on the individual level continued here on a community level with the church listening to and responding to the Jewish people and our concerns. And so we'll see that Catholic statements and initiatives to do with Catholic Jewish relations never become some sort of Catholic pronouncements on another people from on high without their input. But in fact, these statements are highly dialogic. They are mutual documents and initiatives. So while there are ways that I think that the mutual and dialogic process could be improved, I think that this mutuality in seeking together the path forward for Catholics and Jews is of great significance for the unfolding path of Catholic Jewish relations post Nostra Aetate. Hi, everybody. This is Faydra Shapiro and Gavin DaCosta in the discussion portion of our second session on Catholic Jewish relations. And here we'll be talking about the revolution of the Second Vatican Council and the Church's relationship with the Jews.
Great. Phaedra, I want to ask you a question. As a Jewish woman, when you read Nostra Aetate for the first time, and you may not remember it, of course, as you've read it often, what were your reactions?
Right. So it does feel like it was a billion years ago, but I do remember reading it before I knew a lot about Catholicism, and I was interested in Jewish Christian relations sort of very generally. And I remember, thinking, that's it? I mean, that's the big revolution? I found it very, very vague, very general, very Christian, um, very diplomatic and carefully worded. And I thought, well, this doesn't really seem very radical. And it's only years later, in fact, I would say it's really an unfolding process for me to be able to assess and to appreciate how deeply radical and revolutionary uh, it was, and it continues to be.
That's so interesting because I think my reading probably mirrors yours. I was wondering, why is everyone so excited about this? But it's very interesting you use the word revolution, and a lot of people have used this word about Nostra Aetate. What for you, if that word is the right word, is most revolutionary?
Well, how about this, Gavin, as a Catholic theologian? Why don't you answer that question first? What
Okay.
do you, I mean, do you feel that the word revolutionary is appropriate here? I mean, is this actually a revolutionary document?
So there's a kind of one issue behind the scenes that goes on with language when revolution gets used. The Catholic Church is probably one of the most conservative institutions on earth. Tradition and history are absolutely important. Now, revolution sounds like something totally new. And many Catholics argue that, in fact, it is a reversal of previous teachings, and they use revolution in that sense. Now, we get into a bit of a technical discussion, perhaps, but I think I'm resistant to say it is actually a U turn on doctrinal teachings, because for Catholics, that is in effect saying the Church could formally, in its teaching capacity, be wrong when it is making a formal pronouncement. Now, from audio one, it's clear that I think there's been lots wrong transmitted in the Catholic religious traditions. So I'm kind of resistant about revolution because of those particular echoes. But I think, on the other hand, the word actually is appropriate in this sense. For nearly 2,000 years, well, 1,965 years, many Catholics have had a negative view about Jews based on the deicide charge. These people rejected Jesus. They were punished accordingly by God. They, in fact, killed Jesus, the deicide charge, and their dispersion from the Holy Land in 72 Christian calendar time was part of that deserved punishment. Now, what the council does, which is in a sense revolutionary, is it says, no, that ain't right. And that is so incredible. I remember my first reading, I kind of missed how shocking that is to actually hear that the teaching I'd been brought up with as a kid, connected with the Jews have rejected Jesus, they are kind of wicked people. I'm not being too crass there, that's my childhood memory, is suddenly said by the highest authority in the church to be not correct. So clearly, when it says Jews, not all Jews at that time, and certainly not all Jews today, can in any sense bear the guilt of what happened. That's the revolution. Suddenly, by removing that, if you like, contagion in the bloodstream, it allows for a new type of body to emerge, a Catholic culture which is trying to get to grips with its anti Judaism right at its roots. So, that for me is the big, big step. There's one other big, big step, and this may repeat a little bit of what I said, but is suddenly using biblical revelation. Paul, in his letter to Romans, to say, hey, Catholics, look at this biblical verse and see Paul saying that this people are dear to God and God does not go back on his promises. Now, what's very revolutionary is, in effect, saying for nearly 1,650 years, the church has, both in its liturgical traditions and in its theological traditions, thought something else. So there is an overturning. That's my answer.
Okay.
Do you feel you heard those sounds of revolution that I've been talking about?
I mean, it is very, very tempting, very easy to use the word revolution. But I mean, I think similarly, I'm a little bit wary of that kind of language. It's a little bit dangerous and it's a little bit inaccurate. I mean, it's not exactly true that there was nothing positive. Maybe not positive. It's not that there was nothing in Catholic tradition to draw on that, all church teaching about the Jews was uniformly toxic. And
Right.
then there's this like complete 180 at Vatican II, right? I mean, even the catechism of the Council of Trent, right? I mean, that's two councils earlier in the middle of the 16th century, already says that Jews cannot be held collectively responsible for the crucifixion, and that Christians, believers, are even more guilty than the Jews could ever be, because they believe in Christ and yet continue to sin. So I think what's revolutionary maybe about Nostra Aetate is its impact rather than its teaching itself. I'm a little cautious about calling something a revolution that's really like, not 60 years old yet. But I am optimistic, and I think what makes me optimistic is seeing that unfolding path from Nostra Aetate, that, as you say, sort of removing that toxicity from the bloodstream, something healthier is able to flow, and we're seeing that, that path unfold, that process unfold, that we're kind of mapping together in a healthier way as a result of that significant cleansing, perhaps, that comes from
Yeah,
Nostra Aetate.
yeah. I really find helpful what you're saying about Trent, the catechism. And it's perhaps something rather important for Catholics to remember. And it comes up in Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, paragraph 14, that in the end, Catholics are more guilty than anyone else in the sense that they have been, or formally speaking, they've said, yes, I'm trying to live by this truth and I understand it. And then their failings constitute a much graver one than in the biblical narrative. It's quite interesting where Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they know not what they're doing. We have to remember that they is not a collective, all Jews. It's that group there. But even that group there, he says that interesting, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. So I kind of like the way Trent and you in your comment remind us that Trent says Catholics are guilty for the death of Christ in every sin, more profoundly than what happened in that historical encounter. Very powerful. I
Hmm.
like what you're saying about the fruits, and maybe we can come to that. But Phaedra, I just wanted to pick up something really interesting in the opening of your presentation on this topic, where you locate the very special place of Judaism in Catholic thinking. And as an aside, I'm kind of intrigued to ask you, does Christianity have any special place in Jewish thinking, analogous to the revolution, quote unquote, that happened in 1965? While you're thinking about that, can I just say I really found useful this comment you made, which is a puzzlement to many Catholics, that the conversation with Judaism in the Holy See is located in the Committee for Ecumenism, the Pontifical Commission for Ecumenism. And this question then is like a really curious one. There is, in fact, a historical factor that Cardinal Bear, who was in charge of the document, was made head of the Secretariat for Christian Unity. And it was Bear's group and under his chair that the Jewish document, Nostra Aetate, as it eventually turns out, was commissioned to. But it's not just a historical accident. I think there's something quite profound that we as Catholics are still trying to work out. And I would put it like this: the rupture with the Jewish people at the beginning of the emergence of the church is the biggest rupture. And Peter Hocken, a Catholic priest, says if we can't heal that rupture, we will never heal the later ruptures that happened with, let's say, the Eastern churches and the churches of the Reform. It's about learning how to live together as a family. So, going back to the question I threw to you, people listening to this may be interested in, is there any equivalence to Nostra Aetate? Not that there should be. I'm just saying we are the ones who have a lot of heart searching to do, perhaps.
Okay, so wow, let me answer this first one, or at least try to address the kind of I don't know, equality issue.
Hmm.
So there's nothing like that in Judaism. There's no special treatment or particular concern with Christianity. And that makes sense, of course. I mean, the Christian concern with Judaism is completely qualitatively different at its essence than is the Jewish concern with Christianity, right? I mean, we can say that there's something Jewish at the heart of Christianity, but there isn't something Christian at the heart of Judaism. So, we can't sort of expect or seek out any simple parallels here. We do have some statements about Christianity specifically from some, Maimonides, of course, sees Christianity and sees its role as making the God of Israel and the scriptures of Israel known throughout the world. So there is this sort of preparatory messianic role for Christianity, but it's just like a very small statement. We don't have something like the magisterium in Judaism. So our structures are different, our concerns are
Mm.
different. We can't really expect that there would be. However, we do have, of course, particularly as a result of this move, with the council to rethink the relationship with the Jewish people, of course, we then have responses from within the Jewish community about Jewish Christian relations and
Yeah.
what should be the Jewish role in that conversation, if at all. And really, should Jews be participating in any way in the council specifically and in the dialogue and in seeking out a new kind of relationship with Christians? And I speak about Heschel in the recording, who's very active and comes out in a very positive, robust kind of way, both participating in the process of crafting what becomes Nostra Aetate, but also in his writing is a very strong and eloquent proponent for interfaith dialogue. But then we also have at the same time the, I guess, more conservative views, epitomized with Rabbi Soloveitchik, who, confrontation came out on the subject. He wrote an article called Confrontation. It came out, I think, in 1964. Uh, and it's a beautiful piece. It's a really extraordinary piece that, very deeply questions on what basis we we can be in engagement and dialogue with Christians, and what are some of the essential prerequisites for that engagement. And in a kind of unfair summary kind of way, he comes down on the side of that Jews and Christians should not be having theological dialogue. That, the only really viable dialogue between Jews and Christians is on the level of social issues,
Yeah.
that, things that concern us as human beings, social problems, and how we can, you know, address them perhaps, but theology is not an open topic for conversations.
And it could be said, interestingly, that the Vatican has actually followed exactly his promptings in its conversations with the rabbinate in Israel, so that in their meetings there's a kind of clear sense that they cannot interfere with each other's doctrinal viewpoints, but they can discuss the fruits in terms of social value systems, practical questions that they face together. And that's really quite important an insight rather than kind of necessarily simply and exclusively talking about truth claims. The truth claims extend to social teachings. And for me, Soloveitchik's essay is a kind of good reminder that there is a lot of stuff we can talk about, uh, and we don't have any authority to tell another person how their religion should think about the question of revelation. But I should also say I've discovered what you've said about there's no symmetry, there's an asymmetrical relationship. But I have learnt greatly from Jewish statements that have been made in the last 10, 20 years, especially connected with the celebration of Nostra Aetate, and that they really make and should make Christians think, okay, we've been talking about Jews a lot of the time. Now we need to listen and carefully hear what is being said in response. Phaedra, your presentation talked about Heschel and the comment about returning to Auschwitz. He'd rather return to Auschwitz than convert. And I think we should touch on that because that's going to be something we'll return to in audio 3, the next discussion. But the question or the challenge you pose, and I think you pose it very gently but incisively, is can Jewish people feel comfortable in this new dialogue if they know that Catholics are out to convert them? I'm paraphrasing it in a crude way. And I think this is a real challenge. And if I can just say two things about that and do respond, I'm fully on board with the existential horror that conversion may mean not being a Jew. Heschel's comment is like, okay, so you want me to convert? You mean you want me to put aside my Jewishness, and that's a victory to Hitler? At least resisting that, and if necessarily through martyrdom, refusing to extinguish Jewish identity. So I'm very sensitive to that issue. But there is another side, and this is a very difficult side, I think, for Catholics, and it's very unresolved. If Jesus was a Jew, which is what Nostra Aetate teaches, Mary was a pious and faithful Jew, Joseph and the early apostles, is it possible that one can be both Catholic and Jewish? And funnily enough, I have to answer yes, because the founder of our community was a Catholic Jew. And I say that very provocatively because not many people see him as a Catholic in terms of historical criticism. You know, he's a kind of Messianic Jew in some sense with eschatological views, etc. But this is the really difficult question for Catholics in this dialogue, is recognizing, as you put it, the Jewish element in the heart of the church. And that means not eradicating it, but actually valuing it and celebrating it. So I kind of want to just raise the question, not that one should seek conversion of others, but if there is conversion, does it always eradicate Jewish identity? Jesus is a good example where it didn't.
Wow. Okay, this is a really complex and complicated and delicate issue. And I imagine it's one that's going to continue in the conversation on our third session, sort of into the future. Um, but I first want to take issue perhaps with your sort of calling on Jesus and Mary as Jewish Catholics, and even stepping away from the sort of provocative use of Catholic here, because I think that it's a, you'll excuse me, I think it's anachronistic,
Hmm.
and but importantly so, to say that Jesus was a Christian. Uh, Jesus was just Jewish, I think. I and if we think in that kind of way, then the implications are a little bit different. But listen, I mean, I absolutely understand the real tension between kind of valuing Judaism and asserting the ongoing election of the Jewish people and our dearness to God and the Jewishness at the heart of the church and the belief in universal salvation through Christ, right? And I don't think we're going to solve this right here, but I will say this: if all that Catholics can see when they look at Jews is potential Catholics, then we have a real problem. Okay, so that question of whether you can be Jewish and Catholic at the same time, let's get into in our next conversation. But
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think that there's more to it, this sort of conversion question, than just can one be Jewish and Catholic at the same time. It's also how Catholics look at Jews, and if they look at Jews, if they look at the neighbor down the street as sort of sadly unfulfilled. And, if only they could be brought to a knowledge of the real truth, then, they would be sort of complete. If that's their interaction with Jews, with Jewishness, with Judaism, then I think that that's really a sincere problem for the church. I think it's also essential to understand that for Jews, when we are talking about conversion and the Catholic Church and that conversion clause, a hope of conversion, that it's very much read against a history of forced conversions.
yes.
And so I think that Heschel's rather shocking and extremely heartfelt and powerful statement, it needs to be read against that background, that conversion of free volition, and we can discuss if that's even possible, is one thing, but when faced with a choice of conversion or death, says Heschel, he would be willing to go to Auschwitz. So that we're not just talking about people who might choose to become Catholic, but we're talking about that kind of forcible, powerful, imposed conversion choice. And those are two very different things.
Faydra, it's been a joy talking, and I look forward to the next conversation we have after Audio 3.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward as well.